This is The Newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis.
And welcome to another special Q&A live stream on Global Player and on YouTube. We're marking a year of Keir Starmer in Downing Street, and we've been looking at the comments that you've already been putting in to the chat, and you're impatient that you're having to wait. We said 1 o'clock from the outset, didn't we?
Yeah, it's pathetic. Just come at 1 o'clock. You don't need to be here early. I mean, if you've got anything better to do, it's Friday afternoon, go to work.
And also
honestly.
they were saying other podcasts, which shall remain nameless, don't make them wait so long.
Well, yeah.
How dare they?
Well, it's because they've got nothing to say. They just have a go at each other. Anyway, if you've got if you know, you know. If you've got any questions you want to put, if you haven't had a chance to put any questions about a year of Keir Starmer and Labour, you can of course leave them in the comments below, and we'll try and get to them throughout the course of the show. But before that, let's go back 12 months to the day to 5 a.m. on July the 5th, 2025, and this is how we were reacting at the time in Newsagents HQ.
Bloody hell, what a weird election.
Keir Starmer becomes the first person to take his party from opposition to government in 27 years. That is the headline.
It was Rishi Sunak saying, "It's not over till it's over." At 4:45 this morning, it was over.
It's going to be, almost certainly going to be, the Conservatives' worst performance in history.
I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
Rishi Sunak is therefore the biggest loser in Conservative electoral history. The Labour Party very seldom looks happy about anything, but they looked happy today.
Enjoy this moment. Nobody can say you haven't waited patiently.
Britain's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Get used to it. A different tone, slightly more cautious perhaps, and slightly less polished.
They wanted to under-promise and over-deliver.
So has a new dawn broken, or has it not? 412 seats for Labour. Conservatives on 121. 121. Can you imagine?
Believe it.
It's unbelievable.
The Conservative Party had 5 Prime Ministers and less Parliament, and 4 of their seats are now not held by the Conservatives.
If the public were doing one thing last night, it was punishing the leadership. It was punishing every way that the Conservative Party had governed us.
The Labour Party might not have been loved, but the Conservative Party was despised. He's got a bigger majority than any of the governments we've had over the last 14 years have had. There is no reason on paper that Starmer cannot and should not be Prime Minister until 2028 or 2029. He can do what he wants.
He can do what he wants. 12 months on, and after the week that has just gone, it does seem remarkable. I'm not sure your judgment was wrong, but I don't think we could have anticipated the way some of this has unfolded.
Yeah, I think...
Bloody hell, what a weird...
I think in one way... I don't know what...
Bloody hell.
Hey, look, it's live. I think in one way... I think in a way, I sort of stand by what I said there, in the sense that, look, I think the panic around Starmer is being somewhat overdone. I think that these are problems that happen. Yeah, it's been a terrible, terrible week, but I think, and we're going to get to this about Starmer's future, I think his position is still pretty strong. I think maybe what it underestimated to some extent, though, is the extent to which we've talked about it on the show a little bit this week, which is these majorities perhaps don't mean quite as much as they used to. I think what was so shocking about it, or so profound about it a year ago, was, as I was saying there, we hadn't seen a government with a majority like that for going on for 20 years. And it felt as if politics might finally be different, or at least more stable. I never bought the idea that things would be going back to quote-unquote normal, because what is normal? It's not the late 90s anymore, it's not the early 2000s. But it is certainly true that these big majorities, politics is so volatile, so much has structurally changed, and there are so many profound problems afflicting British politics that the sort of majorities that would once have brought you solidity and stability now don't necessarily guarantee those things in the way they used to. I think we've learned that.
We'll come to the question in a minute. I was very struck.
We're doing well here getting to the questions, aren't we?
Well, no, just one thing. In 1997 and the Blair landslide, and, I was political correspondent at Westminster on College Green, And you would have MPs almost like tarts, kind of rolling up their legs and saying, "Come on, you can put me on television," because that was their only means of publicity.
I'm sorry?
They were desperate to be on TV,
Right.
and now they've all got their own Twitter accounts and Insta accounts and everything under the sun.
Are these lives a good idea?
Yeah, I don't know. Who knows? Well, we'll get into trouble. We'll get into trouble. But it's different now, and you're seeing MPs just much more prepared to go their own way, showing far less fealty towards the leader than they did back in the day.
I think that's right. Let's get to the first question. This is from Mark Edwards. Dear Jon and Lewis, in the context of change and getting shit done, and out of the current crop of current ministers, who has been the standout performer in the Labour government in the last year, and who has been as much use as a glass hammer? Love the show. Get yourselves down to Bournemouth for a live show soon, please.
Should we discuss Bournemouth first of all? I'd quite like to go to Bournemouth for a live
Well,
show.
you would.
Why?
Well, it's full of old people.
Oh, that's so predictable.
What can I say?
Saggy
Sorry,
Beach.
Bournemouth. It's a lovely place.
Yeah,
it's a lovely place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's got a big
Lovely little
student
retirement
population. No, it's
Yeah,
got a
no,
huge-
it does. Yeah.
Right. So Lewis Goodall, you don't know what you're talking about.
Correct. Not for the first time. So what do you think? Who has been the standout performer?
I think there's always the difficulty with a question like this is confusing who is on the media a lot.
Yeah.
And if you think they're on the media a lot, you think, oh, they've been very effective. So, I mean...
That's our natural prejudice, right?
Which is our natural prejudice. I mean, Wes, the health secretary, was on the podcast yesterday. He's been on the podcast. Lewis, you almost seem to have a kind of weekly fix with him.
I feel like I'm basically doing counselling sessions with him at this point. I think I've interviewed him about 11 times this year. Can't wait for our 12th, which is presumably this Sunday.
I think he has been effective. I think he is starting to show that things are changing. He's got a clear idea of narrative. We are cutting waiting lists.
Yeah.
We are the extra kind of operations we are performing. Stuff that he promised to do, he seems to be kind of delivering on in some ways. And whilst at the same time saying that the NHS has to reform. So I think he's done well. The other one I think would be standout would be the Business Secretary, Johnny Reynolds. I mean, the 3 trade deals that have been done. Kind of India, the closer proximity to the European Union, the USA, and his department of, Douglas Alexander, and maybe as well we should shout out to the ambassadors who've helped deliver that, Mandelson in Washington, etc. I think there you see, okay, this is a government that is kind of doing stuff and getting stuff done. And for that reason, I would say probably Wes stands out, Johnny Reynolds stands out. I'd say Bridget Phillipson as well stands out, who's kind of had a sort of principled voice. She's not a flamboyant performer, but I think she's been quite effective in making her argument about what she wants to see change in the world of education.
It's interesting you say that. I remember when we did one of these before, and we were talking. It was a similar-ish sort of question about who was doing well, or who. I think it was actually about who would be fancy for the Labour leadership in the sort of Keir under the bus scenario. And I was talking about Rayner, and actually a Labour MP texted me going, don't underestimate Bridget, because actually they were saying, and this actually isn't very comfortable I think for maybe a lot of Labour supporters, they were actually saying the Labour Party base deep down is too middle class actually to support Rayner when it comes to it, but they do really, really want a woman, and Bridget Phillipson has positioned herself very well on the soft left of the Labour Party, and don't be surprised, particularly, there have been sort of reshuffled rumours about her that she could end up getting sent to the back benches or moved or whatever, that she would be able to sort of capitalise on that. Away from the media point, someone who I think has done well, and I think this, it's not a very fashionable thing to say, particularly in the press, but away from the media, where he doesn't have a great experience a lot of the time, or they don't put him up very much, someone who quietly, behind the scenes in government, continues to be very influential is Ed Miliband. It was very, very telling in the spending review. All of this noise that has been about Miliband, indeed from Tony Blair and from others as well, criticising his agenda and the way that he's approaching net zero. It's definitely one of the more radical elements of this government. Very telling, though, that actually, when push comes to shove, when Miliband wants something in terms of spending priorities, he usually gets it. Look at the money he got in the spending review for his priorities. Look at the money that he's got for Great British Energy. The truth is, is actually, for all of the talk and the rumours swirling around him a lot, and there is genuine hostility to him from inside elements of this government, make no mistakes about that, including people close to Starmer. The truth is, he remains close to Starmer personally. Starmer was the one, or Miliband was the one, who brought Starmer into politics, who got him a safe seat in Camden. They remain personally close, and actually, Starmer remains more attuned on environmental and net zero matters to Miliband than is commonly understood. So I think despite all of the noise, Miliband has actually had quite a good first year internally with the government.
I tell you someone who I thought would have a higher profile, and again, I'm talking about profile rather than effectiveness in doing their jobs or not, is Peter Kyle, because he was always seen as one of the highly articulate exponents of, kind of what Starmer was trying to do, and he, pre-election, was out and about a huge amount doing stuff. Now, maybe you'd say, well, the reason he's not out and about now is he's too busy getting on with the job of science and technology. But again, I think that there are one or two questions about him that have been raised about relationship with the tech companies. Is he too close? Is he too cosy?
Some Labour MPs definitely think that.
Yeah. But I think going back to your Ed Miliband point, and maybe this takes us, we'll come back to it, because I think the Ed Miliband point speaks to Keir Starmer's leadership. What on earth is happening if there is briefings going on against him in Downing Street, if Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, is fully supportive of Ed Miliband?
But one of the things we've learned in the first year, right, is that on multiple occasions it has been clear that Starmer has not been in control of his Downing Street, right? And in a way that Prime Ministers previously had been. Think back to the very beginning and the turf wars that took place between Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney. Now, in the end, Morgan McSweeney, now the Chief of Staff, of course, won. And Starmer has been quite explicit, even this week, saying that hiring Gray was a mistake. She was the wrong person in the wrong job. But nonetheless, think back to those early days, which were unstable and difficult. A lot of that was down to the internal instability in Starmer's Downing Street. And I think repeatedly, Starmer, for whatever reason, he's even referred to it in the course of the last week or two, right, that he has not necessarily been aware of things that were going on, speeches that we hadn't read speeches and so on. I think there have been questions about the control over the Downing Street operation that he has.
Just a couple of questions that are coming in now about your tan, Lewis, and whether it's real.
The old David
or not.
Dickinson.
No, well, they're thinking maybe the reason you're not that interested in going to Bournemouth is you've spent the last 2 weeks in Bournemouth on the beach there.
It's not. No. Just a bit of Norway. 2 days in Norway. That's where everyone goes to get their tan.
No
these
one
days.
comes back that brown from 2 days in Norway.
It's light all
You
year
ha-
there at the moment.
You haven't borrowed
It's
Donald,
ideal.
You've
What,
been
you
on
think
Donald Trump's
Bournemouth?
sunbed.
Oh, please, I'd love that. Me and Don on the sunbed. It's straight out of a bottle, of course. Straight out of the bottle. Should we get next
what we
question?
thought. Yeah, it's going to start dripping soon. It's like going to be like Rudy Giuliani's hair dye in that famous news conference.
I'm taking nothing from you about hair dye, pal.
Right.
Honestly. From Ollie Green now.
Oof.
And now, old Ronald Reagan over there. Now, that Keir Starmer has been in power for a year, Ollie says, I'd love to hear your take on how he's performed so far. What do you think are his greatest strengths as a leader and as Prime Minister, and what qualities have helped or hindered him navigate this first year in office? Looking ahead, do you think he has the political skill, the resilience and party support to see out the full parliamentary term?
So I'll go back to the end. I mean, I think that Keir Starmer has shown himself to be tough and quite resilient. I think he is a decent man. I think he's a man of some honour and principle. Do I think he has got a political agility, adeptness, feel, touch? I'm not sure. And I think that, what we were just talking about in terms of Ed Miliband a moment ago is a perfect exemplar of that. If there is control inside number 10 and if everyone is marching to what the tune that Keir Starmer wants, how is stuff like that happening? How do you get backbench revolts like the one you've just had if Keir Starmer has a firm grip and a tight political operation? And I think that this is the central thing that we'll be coming back to again and again, and we've been speaking about a lot this week, is the sense of whether Keir Starmer has a clear narrative of what he wants to do, what is brand Starmer. And he hates the idea that we talk about Starmerism, but Starmer is a stammer at the moment, and they seem to be stammering from one thing to the next.
Yeah, I think, the big context of this, and we should never forget this, right, is that, government is very difficult, and it has never been more difficult than it is now. The in tray that they had when they came into office was so difficult and toxic in many areas. Any one of these things, whether it was the sort of collapse of HE funding, the international scene, the economy, you name it, any one of these things could have preoccupied a government in normal times. They've got to deal with all of it all at once, and it is difficult. I think on the plus side, the thing that I feel about Starmer most, actually, which I think probably, and all of them in fairness, which I think they probably don't get enough credit for, and Sunak started this in fairness to him, I do think that the overall tone of government is more mature. I think the tone of politics overall, at least from their side, is more mature, particularly in the Johnson years and obviously the sort of Truss half second. There was something so corrosive and toxic and tiresome about the endless attempts to start culture wars, the endless attempts every day to find enemies and prosecute that politically every single day. There was a politics of aggression in those years that I think was really difficult and problematic. Starmer doesn't have that. To some extent, that's probably part of their problem, is that they don't think as hard-nosed politically about all of those things. So I think they don't get enough credit for that. But as you say, John, I think, Starmer's big problem, we were talking about this on the show yesterday, he lacks a theory of social justice and he lacks the ability to communicate it, apparently. And that is, I think, a real encumbrance for a Labour Prime Minister. A Labour Prime Minister and a Labour government has to have a sense of moral mission. If you think back to his they became the millstones, but the missions. He said he wanted to have mission-driven government. Then he said he wanted to have end sticking plaster politics, all of these sorts of things. Think back to those missions. They were all perfectly worthy stuff, things about clean power, really important stuff about ending violence, sexual violence against women, loads and lots of important things, the fastest growing economy of the G7, even though that was a bit outlandish. What brought them together? What was the Labour story which knitted them together, which gave them an adhesive and a gel and something that they could go out and tell that story about every single day? It always had, the Starmer project, a smack of the technocrat and the technocracy, and we are living in a hyper-political age. And I think the scale of the problems are such that basically you do need, I think, titanic political figures with a first-class strategic sense, a first-class communication sense, and a genuine first-class connection with the British public. And even then, it might not be possible to overcome the political problems. I think it's fair to say that on all of those so far, Labour and Starmer are falling short of the mark at the moment.
Yeah, and look, you are talking about someone who has to have exceptional skills in every single department to deliver that. I mean, I suspect we overdo the sense of crisis. It's the classic of the genre that a Sunday newspaper journalist, this has been the worst week ever, when you're lacking a kind of lead line into an intro into what's been happening in the week of politics. He's had a really tough week, but he's still there. He's still got a sizable majority. There is a recess now. He can have a reset, but I think that something needs to change by the time that the Labour Party gathers for its conference in September, to have a sense that, okay, we've soldiered on through the first year. We've made some mistakes. We've got some things right. But this is what this is what the next 4 years looks like.
I agree with that. And he, again, on the plus side, and again, it sort of links back to what I was saying, I think it's by common consent, he has acquitted himself particularly well on the international stage.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. And again, there were years where, not with Cameron or May, but certainly with Johnson and again Truss, you sometimes felt a bit ashamed, actually. Of the way that foreign leaders would interact with these people. Again, because they had this sort of politics of aggression, they were constantly looking to pick fights. Look what Truss said about, Macron being friend or foe. Absurd, offensive, ridiculous. Starmer doesn't do that. He acquits himself well on the international stage. You can see other leaders respect him. That's great. Unfortunately, foreign policy rarely, if ever, wins a party a general election.
Although at this particular time of international uncertainty and the state of play in, Russia, Ukraine and all the rest of it, maybe it will play a more important role. I just want to get this question from Alfie that has come on the chat. Do you think the new party announced by Zara Sultana, and potentially Corbyn in brackets, will split the left and the left vote akin to the Conservatives and Reform?
Well, look, I think it is very clear that there has been some very open terrain in British politics for some time now on the left and the populist left of politics. It is unfashionable to say in SW1 in the media sort of environment that we have, but there is a big appetite out there for that. We saw that in the Corbyn years. Never forget, Jeremy Corbyn, there were particular circumstances around it, but Jeremy Corbyn got 40% of the vote in 2017, way above what Keir Starmer got in 2024. There is an appetite out there for it. It wouldn't be a sort of necessarily a winning election coalition, but there is an appetite out there for it. I think the biggest encumbrance remains, however, as is always often the case on the left, which is, the phrase probably involves the word brewery and piss up. And even last night we saw, and there's been a lot of speculation about Zara Sultana and Corbyn forming a new party, which could, and the polling suggests that if a new party like that could get 10% of the vote or something, which could be really damaging to Labour. But even last night, if you're going to do that, you know how you don't want to do it? You don't want to announce it via a tweet, which gets, 1,500 likes late on Thursday night. You want to have an event. You want to get television cameras there. You want an incredible social media operation. You want to create some buzz and some vibe. And it became clear last night that it's not entirely certain yet whether Corbyn has actually even signed up to this. You could imagine a Zara Sultana, Corbyn-led leadership being very appealing to a segment of the population. There's a sort of hint of the sort of Bernie Sanders AOC, our version of that to it. But they're going to have to get their act together if they're serious about it.
I think that this question goes to the heart of what we have seen over the past 2-3 weeks playing out in the Labour Party, which is the biggest threat to Labour at the next election reform? In which case, do you become a more populist, anti-immigrant, sense the frustration, go for the grievance politics? In which case, Labour opens up and exposes itself to a lot of disaffected voters going left to the Green Party, but maybe now to a hard left party with Corbyn and Sultana at the head of it. Which way does it go? Where is the biggest risk to Labour? And you've got in Morgan McSweeney someone who believes that reform poses the greatest threat, the Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer, that reform poses the greatest threat, and you have to be talking the tough on immigration and the like, which, Keir Starmer has walked back some of what he said, nation of strangers and all the rest of it. Or do you go and say, right, we're going to become a more left-wing organisation because the exposed flank we have are the Greens and the hard left and those people who feel disaffected that the Labour Party isn't left-wing enough. And in this very kind of split politics that we're in, febrile politics, where people don't have much in the way of tribal loyalties anymore, that's a really open question and a big strategic question. Going back to your point about what Starmer needs to do in the next year or so he's got to answer that question.
Yeah, it's one that, unlike the Conservatives, who have basically been battling with a threat to their right flank on and off for 20 years now, as a result of Farage and UKIP and then Brexit Party and whatever, it's not really something that Labour has had to deal with before to its left. So it would, whether it's the Greens, whether it's this new enterprise, if it ever gets off the ground with Corbyn and Sultana, it would definitely change the game, and it would change the calculus on what the government was doing and how it was talking about its politics. No doubt about that. Joe in Leeds says, Starmer's cautious message discipline style feels outdated in an era where authenticity is everything. After years of spin, people now trust directness, even from figures like Trump and Farage, because it feels more honest. Is Starmer's careful, unifying approach simply out of sync with a political culture that values straight talking over consensus building?
I think, Joe, thanks for the question. I think I would frame it slightly differently, and it goes back to, Lewis, something you were saying, that I think where I kind of welcome some of what Starmer has brought is it hasn't been the populist style of Trump and Farage to say there are really simple solutions to complex problems. We had that with Johnson. The boosterism, it was all going to be fine after Brexit. There was no big issues to be worried about. I like the fact that, Starmer says, actually, we've got to roll up our sleeves. Some of this is going to take time. We've got to build in change. It's not going to happen overnight. People have got to be patient. But it's the way he communicates that. And I think that, Keir Starmer is never going to be that bloke who is the hail fellow, well met, easygoing, person that you meet down the pub and think I could have a pint with, in the way that Farage sort of does come across like that. And Farage is very, very good at retail politics, of getting himself into a crowd, having a laugh with anybody, even though in some ways he can be an extremely brittle politician. I mean, Keir Starmer is... Keir Starmer reminds me slightly in the way that he communicates with this sort of rather brittle approach of John Major back in the Major years. I mean, Major had a bit more folksy appeal, but there was something so easy to parody about John Major as there is about Keir Starmer. And I think that communication skill is something that, some people have it, some people don't. I think he is authentic. I don't think he's inauthentic. I just don't think he's very exciting.
Yeah, I think he is who he is, and that's the I think one of his problems is that, and I think this is true with the Parliamentary Labour Party. I think it's true with the public. I think he is quite a remote figure. I think he's quite a aloof figure. I think he's a man in his early 60s. I don't think he finds it particularly easy or desirable to emote a lot. I don't think he likes talking about himself a lot. I don't think he certainly doesn't like talking about his beliefs and sort of trying to find a sort of deep intellectual into hinterland with himself. And there was that very revealing interview in The Guardian, wasn't there, during the election campaign when he was asked about, does he dream? He says, I never dream. He said, what was the last book you read? He said, well, I don't really read. He doesn't have this. I mean, I think I've occasionally, you sort of talk to people sometimes who know him well, and you say, but who's the real guy? Who is he really? And they say, well, honestly, there's a lot more than what you see, right? Yeah. And maybe that's problematic. I do think though, there are things that the current operation could do to, if not change the man, then change the way that the government communicates. And I do think for sure, I think the government remains, Labour Party generally, I think it remains stuck in a different era. I think Joe is onto something here. I think they remain in a different era of communications that no longer applies. I still think they're in a lot of command and control, late 90s, early 2000s style. I think they're afraid of putting up politicians with more character and more, quote-unquote, authenticity because they're afraid of the message in discipline. That era's dead. That era's gone. That era when you could put a minister up in the morning and that message would command the narrative for the day or be the sort of talking point of the day, it's gone. It's done, insofar it was ever even there. And what you've got to do instead, and it's really exhausting and difficult, is you've got to have 100 different media strategies for 100 different mediums or media, which is deeply fragmented, and you've got to be doing everything everywhere all at once. And that is difficult. But what it does afford you to do is take some risks. Look at the politicians who are popular, who are authentic, quote unquote. They make mistakes, the Rayners, the Johnsons, the Trumps, the Farages. And what do? They just sort of gloss over it. It doesn't matter. And what I would say is that this reshuffle, when it comes, yes, they've got to make sure that they've got, effective operators in departments. I would say prioritise that Minister of State level. If I was sat in number 10, I would be thinking the most important thing, frankly, at the moment, maybe this is our prejudice, but the most important thing at the moment in this hostile political environment, you've got to have great communicators, and you've got to have authentic, real communicators. The era of the kind of Dalek automaton minister with the lines to take, there's almost no point putting them up because the public are so cynical and so bored of it, their eyes glaze over and they don't listen. So I do think there does need to be a regearing and a reshift.
I can't remember who it was the other day I heard on the radio and saying, no, I think the question you're trying to ask me is ... And I thought, oh, for God's sake, no one's going to buy that. No one's going to buy you trying to shift the question to something you want to answer. Just engage honestly and openly. And, maybe we've seen a bit of it this week that, obviously the hideousness of what Rachel Reeves has been through. But I don't know, do we have a proper explanation of it? I accept it. It was something personal. It wasn't what it seemed. But again, it would have been perfectly natural to have been really upset, having been under the pressure that she'd been under. Maybe it was a whole bunch of things that kind of lead you to losing it. And that sort of lack of authenticity and openness and opaqueness, I think the electorate sees through and just thinks, oh, I'm fed up with all these politicians. I don't care whether they're Labour or they're Tory.
Well, I mean, it should terrify, I think, not just Starmer, but any, Labour Party, other people in mainstream of politics. Farage has got more followers on TikTok than every other British politician put together. Right?
Wow, that's a stat.
Yeah. Now, you've got to have a better way of breaking through on this media. I still think that there's still so much of a kind of tendency towards, thinking about the newspapers and the traditional broadcasters. Again, we would say this, wouldn't we? Yeah.
The pool clip for the news.
Yeah.
It seems so outdated.
But you can only break through on those things when you have something to say and an engaging way of saying it. Neither, I think, would appreciate the comparison. But look at the commanding pull that Mamdani in New York and Robert Jenrick have managed to affect in their different parts of politics.
Yeah.
But through very similar methods, right? The power of the vertical video. Forget the text-based stuff, forget the stuff like Twitter. That is the way those arresting videos that are shared and highly shareable and that have something to say. And it might not always be actually the most compelling policy message. It might not always be the most effective. It's when people are complaining about Mamdani in New York, they're saying, oh, well, that wouldn't work. And it may not well when he gets there. But as a piece of political campaigning, it is so potent because he understands, generationally, he understands the way that the media is changing. And I see so little evidence of any of that sort of understanding on the centre-left of British politics right now.
But just before we come to the next question, I did think yesterday, hearing that Donald Trump's one big beautiful bill had got through with the barest hint of a rebellion, even though it's adding $3 trillion to the US deficit, where Keir Starmer has to concede endlessly on welfare reform. I think, if Keir Starmer could learn to intimidate and frighten the lives out of every one of his backbenchers, maybe he'd have an easier time governing.
Well, also, whatever the message is, the other thing is just stick to it. I mean, I was thinking the other day, making note the other day of the sort of just the messages they've spooled through in a year. So we've gone from this is a toxic inheritance to things will get worse before they get better to we've already turned a corner to mission-driven government, which became milestone-driven government, to the tepid bath of decline, to islands of strangers, to stability being the change, to Nigel Farage being wrong, to Nigel Farage being right, to Labour being the insurgent, scrapping an NHS England, end of sticking plaster politics, and back again. And any one of those things might be the right message, but you've got to stick to it.
Right, which brings us to the next question, which is from Jane. And it's this. Is Starmer likely to face a leadership challenge this year after all that's happened recently, given the Labour seem to be constantly trailing reform in the opinion polls?
I think there is a moment of danger, and that moment of danger is next May, which is the local elections and the Scottish and Welsh Parliament elections. There is a very strong possibility that Labour could lose control of Wales for the first time since the creation of the Senate of the Welsh Assembly, as it then was, in the late 90s. That would be a seismic moment for the Labour Party. If Labour doesn't do well in Scotland, could even potentially be overtaken by a reform in Holyrood. Remember, it was only quite recently that Labour were hoping to be back in the game in Scotland. And then, to be fair, there was, of course, the by-election result that they won in Hamilton in the Scottish Parliament. So, anything is possible. But if all of the chatter that you hear is, if there is a moment of genuine peril for Starmer, it will be then. The only thing I would say is that the Labour Party is very bad at getting rid of its leaders. It's not like the Tory Party. Structurally, psychologically, this party of comrades can overdo that, but nonetheless, this party does not have a history of moving even against dud leaders. And to remove a leader who, for all of his faults and for how shallow it was, whatever, won a majority of over 160 less than 2 years before, by the time we get to next May, I don't quite see it. I could be wrong, things could have changed, but I don't quite see it.
Certainly as we stand at the moment, has Keir Starmer had a tough time? Tick, yes. Is it close to the stage where someone would challenge? And as you say, Lewis, the Labour Party history, I think they're a much more nostalgic party and not as brutal and as ruthless,
They're not as ruthless,
as the Tories. The Tories think, God, this leader is crap, right, you're gone. I mean, you look at, Hague, William Hague, and then it was IDS, and so you're right. We don't like this leader; they're crap, they're out, and we saw it writ large. Over the last Parliament, where there were umpteen different prime ministers who came and went in the space of 5 years. So I think that it's highly unlikely, unless something is absolutely spiralling, spinning out of control in a way that is way, way worse than anything we've seen so far. Who's going to organise it? Yeah. Where's it going to come from? Where is the backing going to be? Labour have no... I'm trying to think... Harold Wilson stood down of his own accord and was replaced by Callaghan as Prime Minister. Tony Blair eventually was he sort of stood down, but he was sort of pushed by Gordon Brown.
A long time,
but that was... just think how long that took. That took from Tony Blair winning the leadership in 94.
And with a Chancellor who every single day was pushing at him and wanted him out. And that's the other thing I think that mitigates against the prospect. I think that there is not an obvious alternative candidate and there is no obvious alternative strategy. If that alternative were to come from anywhere, it would be from the left. And that is another reason why I think Starmer is safer than he might appear, because there is enough of the Labour Party that would fear what would happen next. Remember, Jeremy Corbyn's ascension to the leadership is not so long ago. It happened in 2015, 10 years ago. That runs through like an absolute toxic seam on the right of the Labour Party. The fear, and it would be unpredictable because it would go out to the members, the fear of who might replace Starmer would mean that there would be, even if he is not loved by that wing of the party, that they would rally round him in those circumstances. So I think they should consider themselves lucky that Burnham's not in Parliament. I think if Burnham were in Parliament, there may be a slightly different calculus to the whole thing.
Do you think Burnham's on manoeuvres?
Yes. I mean, I think they all are, right? Again, you mentioned a number of interviews I've had with Wes Streeting. On Sunday, he was very strong. I'm not saying, by the way, he doesn't believe this, because I'm sure he does. But nonetheless, he was very keen to point out, when asking him about the Glastonbury situation, how the Israeli embassy had to get its own house in order. I think, Wes making obvious gestures to the left, I think is quite notable. And you're seeing that Sadiq Khan, Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, Burnham, they're all trying to put themselves in the position that if the moment comes, then they're ready. But of course, Burnham's big problem is he's not in Parliament.
Yes, and that's not that easy to organise. That someone stands down, there is a safe seat created by elections. Politics is uncertain in this country. And I think electorates take against the idea that they're being manipulated or used. And that was always the argument about, could David Miliband come back and become the next Labour Party leader? I mean, it was easy to theorise, but once you started looking at the practice...
It's like Boris Johnson.
Same thing. What it would take, and Boris Johnson, what it would take to get them back, who's going to give up the seat? Will the voters just pliantly go along and say, OK, yeah, we'll put you back in as our MP so that you can become the next party leader?
A little bit of breaking news, John. We can't do this all the time, can we?
Oh, breaking
news. Little bit of breaking news.
Can we have a whoosh?
Whoosh, whoosh. Breaking news. Jeremy Corbyn has just tweeted under the aegis of saying, real change is coming. And then has put out a statement saying, real change is coming. 1 year on from the election, this Labour government has refused to deliver the change people expected and deserve. Poverty, inequality and war are not inevitable. Our country needs to change now. Congratulations to Sara Sultana on her principled decision to leave the Labour Party. I'm delighted she will help us build a real alternative. The democratic foundations of a new kind of political party will soon take shape. Discussions are ongoing, and I'm excited to work alongside all communities to fight for the future people deserve. Together, we can create something that is desperately missing from our broken political system.
Hang on. That sounds like great. You haven't discussed this with me. We haven't got this sorted out.
Yeah, he's not
You've
committing.
jumped the gun. Yeah. Isn't it a bit? I mean,
discussions are ongoing.
Discussions are ongoing. Doesn't sound like the Gang of Four and the Limehouse Declaration, where they've kind of, setting out what the new dawn will look like.
It's not ideal, is it? But anyway, it's interesting. He's keeping the door open to it.
Yeah. Well, you're going to, back to your phrase of piss-ups and breweries.
Yeah.
Let's go to Kath, who sent this question on Blue Sky. Assuming Starmer doesn't want to continue as PM after this term, when is the right time for them to identify a new leader, and how should they position them in the cabinet as the successor? Thanks. Kath, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's based on a false assumption, which is that if Starmer were to go, could he anoint a successor in that way? Because I think that, if you look at it, David Cameron was trying to anoint George Osborne to be his natural successor. Politics rarely works out like that. Politics rarely works out that you can just say, I want this person to be my replacement. I'll make them chancellor. I'll make them this or that in that way.
Also, I don't think, there aren't loads of stormtroopers, there aren't loads. There's not a lot of Starmerites as such. He's always been a useful player for parts of the party to use. I don't think it was the case, for example, when Morgan McSweeney was looking around for someone. It wasn't that they'd had this long established political relationship that had been built up over years. It was a marriage of convenience. And so there isn't a strong, in the way there was for Blair or there was for Brown or there have been for previous Labour leaders, there isn't a strong Starmer faction as such. That's one of his problems at the moment. He doesn't have a sort of big bench that he can sort of turn to for support when he needs to. So I don't think, if Starmer did want to anoint a successor, which I'm not even sure he would, I just don't think that he's that sort of leader with that sort of factional basis that he'd find it easy to do so. And I suspect right now, he will, of course, just be thinking about getting to the next election. We know one thing about Starmer. He's a highly competitive person. He's very, very competitive. He wants to win and he loves winning. He will be, I mean, there's that amazing bit of the Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrom book, right? Which is these results a year ago when we were sat here, these results still coming in, and he's projected to get a majority of whatever it was, 167, but it was like 5 fewer than Blair. And they were both gutted about it because they wanted to beat Blair.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure Blair was probably privately quite happy. Yeah. But, you know, like, that tells you something about the psychology of the guy. He will not just want to win one election. He'll want to win 2. Whether he goes for the whole of the next term is a different question, but he'll want to win 2.
I've just been thinking while we've been talking about that, the only person who successfully anointed their successor to be Prime Minister, I suppose, was Thatcher in John Major, in that she made him Foreign Secretary, he'd had no experience in foreign affairs. And I remember Jonathan Aitken, who was then a Tory MP, subsequently got into some trouble. But Jonathan Aitken said, John Major as Foreign Secretary, he thinks the Sinai is the plural of sinus. And, you know, there was so much disparaging chat about, you know, John Major. But Thatcher did succeed and then got bitterly disillusioned with him the moment he became Prime Minister.
Starmer, if you listen to Starmer at the moment, he constantly talks about, he loves the idea of being underestimated. You know, he constantly, one of his lines at the moment is, you know, they said we couldn't change the Labour Party and I did it, and we said we couldn't win the election, I did it, and they'll say I can't win another election. So he likes the idea, he doesn't like, it is one of the things about him, he doesn't like Westminster, he doesn't like the Westminster quote-unquote establishment. There is like for all of his talk about being in the establishment, he does have the sort of, he's got this thing inside him which he does see himself as an outsider to it, possibly because he came into politics so late. He finds a lot of Westminster quite tedious, the sort of commentariat, the Parliament, all of that sort of stuff. So he likes proving them wrong, and doubtless that will be burning inside him. So I don't think the idea of a successor is anywhere near the front of his mind at the moment.
Well, apparently he's still incredibly competitive for five-a-side football.
Indeed so.
That he can't bear the idea of ever losing five-a-side. So,
indeed.
Anyway,
much like myself.
You haven't kicked a football, only mistakenly.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I mean, come on.
What? How dare you?
A little bit of snooker when you were trying to get off games.
Yeah. I'm more of a 7-a-side man.
The famous seven-a-side.
The famous seven-a-side.
Famous seven-a-side football.
Well, it's good news is something more up my street, which is that Mary Todd has got a question. So it's lovely to hear that the First Lady to Abraham Lincoln is listening. Thanks very much, Mary. Starmer seems to be enjoying his greatest successes on the world stage rather than domestically right now. But are you concerned that Starmer's relationship with Trump could disintegrate at some point over the next 12 months?
Well, I think that anyone's relationship could disintegrate with Donald Trump over the next 12 minutes. I mean, there is nothing that's bankable about anything with Donald Trump. And just look what's happened with, you know, where Elon Musk is now compared to where he was 2 months ago, 3 months ago, when he was more or less picking who would be in Donald Trump's cabinet.
Now he's going to deport him.
And now he's facing deportation from the United States for having maybe come in illegally or whatever from South Africa. God knows what's going on there. So, yeah, any relationship could disintegrate with Donald Trump. I think that Starmer, for the most part, has played it pretty skillfully with Donald Trump, even though it may be at times a little gut-wrenching to watch the fawning, the picking up the papers, the handing the envelope with the invitation for the second state visit.
Yeah, look, I think I have to say, one of the things that surprised me most about the last 12 months, or I suppose the last 6 months since Trump came in, their relationship, the relationship between them is pretty good. I mean, I really thought, you know, if you put a gun to my head 6 months ago, I thought Trump would start mocking him quite quickly. I thought he would just think that he was just a sort of bit of a non-entity. And I was talking to someone sort of close to Starmer about it not long ago and saying, is it real? And they said, no, they really do seem to get on. And they said something really interesting, which is that I think that Trump perceives him not as a threat to attention. I think one of the reasons he doesn't like Zelensky so much, right, is that he's so adored by so many. And Trump always wants to be adored. I suspect he doesn't quite perceive Starmer in that way, right? He doesn't perceive him as a threat.
He's not a peacock.
No, in the way that Macron is. Exactly, when he's like, Emmanuel, he's a real publicity seeker. Like, imagine being called publicity seeker
for Donald Trump.
I mean, honestly.
But I think that the relationship does endure. I think the fact of the matter is that Britain has managed to get something of a trade deal. I mean, far less good than it was before Donald Trump became president, but better than an awful lot of other countries who are kind of toiling with appalling tariffs on their goods.
And at certain moments, to be fair to Starmer, although obviously I think they've played it well in not sort of being out there and not peacocking, but on a couple of occasions they have done things that probably the White House would not have much approved of. You know, when Zelensky and Trump blew up in the Oval Office, it was pretty classy the way Starmer dealt with it. You know, coming
Going
out,
down Downing Street to meet him.
going in front of the full glare of the world's television cameras, walking down Downing Street, which a Prime Minister never does, to go and greet him and embrace him. And it was, you know, it's the cliche, but it was a picture that said more than words ever could, right? It was a smart move. Likewise, you know, I think, you know, for my own part, I think the government could have done a lot more on it. But, you know, the White House was not happy when HMG put sanctions on Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in the Israeli government. They were not happy about that at all. So there have been moments of genuine division between the two sides. But I mean, a British Prime Minister kind of has to. I mean, his calculation from the very beginning, right, has been that if Britain wants to do anything, it still needs Trump in the United States. And the bet has been that they might be able to keep Trump on side sufficiently to be able at least to achieve some policy outcomes, which he does seem to be something of a conduit, a genuine conduit. I was always very sceptical of that idea that, you know, the sort of Britain being the bridge and so on. I think in fairness, on this occasion, Starmer is something of a bridge between Europe and the Trump administration.
And the
at least for now.
commentariat view was that he would have to make a choice between either being close to America or being close to Europe, and you couldn't be close to both. And actually, I think so far Starmer has achieved that. I think Starmer has kept us close to the United States of America and has moved us closer to Europe, thank the Lord.
Yeah. One final question now from Aaron Cardwell, who says, I'm a teacher and it's school report season. Actually, just before we do that, it reminds me, I wonder if it's the teacher that I met last night when I was out for dinner, who came up to me and said that he said, Lewis, would you mind, I'd really like a selfie. I said, oh, of course, that's absolutely fine. And he said, to be honest with you, I'm out on a date and I think this has completely ruined the date, but it's totally worth it. I told him to get a life, honestly. Poor girl he was with. Honestly, get a grip.
Honestly.
Said goodbye to them on the way out. Honestly, the people,
people
who listen to this show, honestly,
just as
take a long, hard look at yourselves.
It was good that you said that you had said yes to the selfie. Have you ever said no to one?
Oh, I'm not taking any lectures from you about that. Honestly, there's barely a phone in this. You go up to people and ask them if they want a selfie.
So I was standing Leicester Square after this recording.
Anyone at all?
Hello, I'm available.
Anyway, Aaron says, I'm a teacher. It's school report season. What would Keir's PM school report look like so far, and what should he do in the next 12 months to improve? Go on then, Mr. Sopel. Headmaster Sopel. Must do better.
You're working very hard, Keir, and we appreciate the contribution he makes to class. But I think he needs to show a little more leadership if he wants to be the head boy of this school and give a clear sense of direction and purpose to what we're doing.
I think the question, if Starmer were a pupil, I think the question would be, and it's an open question, I don't know what the answer is, has he got another gear? He is often, in fairness to him, he is often underestimated. He is right, he has been frequently underestimated. Very few people would ever have thought that he would have achieved what he did achieve. Remember how close he got to resignation, even as late as 2021. But how adaptable is he? Can an old dog learn new tricks? And can he keep going and keep being adaptable and changing and find that extra gear in terms of his communication style and his political thinking? I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that. But it really matters, not just to the Labour Party, because let's be honest, this isn't just a normal parliament. This isn't just a question, I think, of, well, Labour lose and the Tories get back in and Badenoch is Prime Minister. That could happen, of course it could. But there is a real sense, and it's a real change in our politics, right? That the two-party system as we've known it, politics as we've known it, is perhaps on its last legs, and it is its last chance. And if you think mainstream politics and the two-party system as we've had it is worth saving, and you don't want the alternative, which is a potentially complete transformation of the way we've done politics in this country, a reform-led government at least, then it matters if this government succeeds and is seen to succeed. So the stakes are high, and the burden and the weight on his shoulders is heavy indeed.
That was 3 pages of a school report there.
Mr. Goodall could be a little pithier.
Mr. Goodall may pay a little more attention to concision.
All right. Sorry, sir.
That is it for our special Q&A marking Keir Starmer 1 year on Global Player and YouTube. You'll be able to hear this as a podcast a little bit later on. Yeah, we
really?
will. Yeah, you
that
will.
Sounds
As
good.
normal.
We should do a podcast.
But we'll be back on Monday. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.